In the words of Khorne, the 8th captain of the World Eaters, from his own unpublished treatise on the XVIII Legions.
The moment Angron was given mastery over us, we stopped being what the Emperor wanted and became what our father wanted instead. How could he have not foreseen the madness to come when it was he who made it happen? Or did he even care, so long as we spilled the blood he needed spilled to expand his realm? If you desire to cast fault on the path that the 12th Legion embarked upon, then the blame could be placed nowhere other than the throne of Terra, at his feet.
The destruction of the Aetarian technocracy was another one of the major moments of the Great Crusade where the World Eaters were heavily involved. During the pivotal year of 004 M31, the Sons of Horus, fresh from the miraculous recovery of the Primarch on the feral world of Davin, encountered a highly advanced human civilization known as the Aetarian technocracy. The technocracy was on the planet of Eros, and they had emerged from mankind's early foray to the stars, which occurred during the Dark Age of technology as a major power within the sector. Their culture and technology had evolved in a manner strikingly similar to that of the Imperium, in particular resembling the Mechanicus of Mars more than anything else. This made their society both fascinating and dangerous in the eyes of the Imperium and most Imperial commanders, in particular since they held rare, valuable, and rather powerful standard template constructs, some which have been lost to humanity since the Age of Strife. Horus, now the War Master, along with his retinue of Sons of Horus, engaged in diplomatic discussions with Fabricator Consul, the leader of the technocracy, in an effort to bring their world into compliance with the Emperor's grand design. However, the meeting held aboard the Vengeful Spirit would take a rather violent turn. During their exchange, Horus discovered that the technocracy had access to some rather coveted SCC designs, which would serve as vital tools in the War Master's upcoming campaign. Yet instead of negotiating for their alliance, Horus's response to this information was rather swift and brutal. He drew his bolt pistol and executed the Fabricator Consul on the spot. Without warning or hesitation, the technocracy's elite, who were known as the Brotherhood, which in no small amount of coincidence also wore power armor and wielded weaponry and technology very similar to the Space Marines, were likewise annihilated in a brutal act of violence and supremacy. While the official explanation given by Horus for his sudden violent actions stated that the Fabricator Consul had planned an assassination attempt, the truth was far more complex. By this time, Horus had already begun his descent into madness, his soul corrupted at its root by the ruinous powers. His actions against the technocracy were not merely about self-defense, but rather a symptom of his growing disillusionment and the spread of corruption within the Sons of Horus Legion. Over the course of the next 6 months, the conflict would escalate into a bloody war of attrition, where Horus was forced to call upon the World Eaters, led by their Primarch Angron, to assist with the War Master's campaign. The final assault on the Iron Citadel, which was the Brotherhood's last stronghold, would come at a bloody climax, as Angron's blood-soaked warriors breached the fortress walls. The Brotherhood, in a final act of defiance, detonated explosive charges, burying the attackers under tons upon tons of rubble. Yet Angron, consumed by unremittent rage, tore his way free and massacred the remaining Brotherhood defenders with his monstrous chain axe Gorefather. Amongst the dead was Ephraim Guardia, the senior preceptor and castellan of the Iron Citadel, whose life was claimed in the opening moments of Angron's unleashed fury. The destruction of the Brotherhood and the subsequent seizure of their advanced technologies by the Sons of Horus represented a decisive end to the technocracy's existence. However, the ramifications of this victory would echo far beyond the world. Horus, ever ambitious, used the technocracy's STC data to court the allegiance of Kelbor Hall, the Fabricator General of Mars, along with a faction of the Adeptus Mechanicus. With the lure of these unknown and potentially forbidden technologies, Horus manipulated them into betraying the Emperor, an act that would set the stage for the Schism of Mars, and so the Dark Mechanicum would rise from the ashes of betrayal, forever altering the course of humanity and plunging the Mechanicus into civil war, unfortunately causing the loss of uncountable amounts of technological advancements. With a large sum of its technological heritage destroyed, Horus, in essence, laid the very foundation of the current Adeptus Mechanicum. Following that, in the same year of 004 M31, Horus, ever the strategist, sought to quash an uprising on the technologically advanced world of Agita, which had fallen into the hands of Imperial separatists. To bring the rebellious world back into line, he called upon 3 of the Emperor's legions, the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters, and the Ultramarines. The initial conquest was rather swift, but the key to the world's fall lay in the capture of a massive fortress where the separatist leaders had taken refuge. Horus, eager to press forward, tasked Angron with the assault on the citadel, instructing him to focus on the leaders alone and to show no mercy. Angron, ever the unchained embodiment of rage, led his legion into the heart of the fortress with a brutal and singular purpose: annihilation. What followed was a savage massacre. The defenders, though well armed and heavily entrenched, were no match for the fury of the nail-enhanced World Eaters, who surged forth over the bodies of their own fallen comrades. The cost was immense, with a dozen World Eaters falling mere meters from the fortress walls. As the last remnants of the fortress fell to the World Eaters, their fury was running at full bore. The rampage that followed left the interior of the citadel as a garish sight, the defenders torn apart, their dismembered bodies scattered across the hallways, creating a scene that would haunt even the most hardened Astartes. By the time the Ultramarines arrived, the battle was already over, but the carnage that they left behind spoke volumes. The World Eaters' brutality in the aftermath of the battle was undeniable. The Ultramarines, disgusted by the savagery they witnessed, reported the atrocities to the Emperor, but the damage was done. Horus, now fully embracing the influence of chaos, saw the World Eaters' uncontrollable rage as the perfect fit for the ruinous powers. Thus, the cleansing of Agita was not just the end of the rebellion, but it marked one of the nexus points of corruption for Horus and his legion, along with the World Eaters, who themselves were already walking the path of the damned. By the dawning of the 31st millennium, the World Eaters had descended into even more savage fits of bloodlust. Their once noble cause had been eclipsed by the barbaric whims of their damaged Primarch. His tyranny, fueled by the brutal implantation of the butcher's nails, spiraled out of control, and his brethren, his fellow Primarchs, began to voice their concerns directly to the Emperor. The situation was dire, but the Emperor, with the weight of the galaxy upon his shoulders, had already left the Great Crusade and returned to Terra. In his absence, he had entrusted the task of confronting Angron to one of the men he trusted the most, above all others, Horus Lupercal, the War Master. However, what the Emperor did not know was that Horus, whom he had raised to the highest ranks amongst his sons, the first amongst equals, had already been corrupted by the ruinous powers of chaos, following his campaign to reconquer the plague moon of Davin. Horus had succumbed to the whispers of the dark gods, and the seeds of betrayal had already taken root deep within his soul. In Angron, Horus saw an ally who shared his deep bitterness towards the Emperor, and it did not take long for the War Master to feed his resentment, recounting to Angron the Emperor's abandonment of him on Nuceria, a world that had once seen the brutal crushing of Angron's hopes. With these words and the honeyed tones of one of the most, if not the single most charismatic of the Primarchs, Horus stoked Angron's fury, twisting the Emperor's perceived betrayal into justification for a darker, more insidious cause. In Horus, Angron had seen not only a fellow warrior, but a leader strong enough to replace the Emperor, a man who would allow them to revel in their shared hatred. Horus's words were like a balm to Angron's wounded pride, and in the end, the World Eaters would stand beside the War Master when Horus ignited the heresy. As the galaxy would be plunged into chaos, the World Eaters eagerly joined Horus's rebellion, casting aside the Emperor's light for the promise of blood and war. The World Eaters became one of the original 4 traitor legions alongside the Death Guard, the Word Bearers, and the Sons of Horus. And so the die had been cast, and the chains began to encircle Angron and his sons. For while the Emperor may have freed Angron of his masters on Nuceria, he had been fitted with a collar, and as Horus had promised him freedom from the Emperors, Angron had not noticed that he would be given over to a new master, a new owner, one who would wield the chains tighter than any other. Up next was the Isstvan III atrocity. It was a harrowing year of 005 M31 on the ashen surface of Isstvan III that the galaxy bore witness to the opening salvos of the Horus heresy. Known grimly as the Isstvan III atrocity, this event would mark the moment when War Master Horus openly defied the Emperor casting aside any pretense of loyalty and plunging the Imperium into the fires of betrayal and civil war. Yet even amidst the chaos of rebellion, it became apparent that one of Horus's most powerful allies, the ever-volatile Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, was still an uncontrollable force, driven by his own bloodlust more than any allegiance to a master, even Horus himself. The atrocity began with a murder stroke of deception. Horus had sent the loyalist enemies of the four soon-to-be traitor legions, the Sons of Horus, the Emperor's Children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters, to the surface of Isstvan III, under the guise of eradicating a rebellion. The Astartes were oblivious to the betrayal awaiting them. As their assault raged against the Slaaneshi-aligned rebels, who were entrenched in Coral City, Horus unleashed his treacherous scheme. His fleet, stationed high up in orbit, rained death upon the world in the form of a virus bomb. The deployment of the horrifying Life-Eater virus eradicated all biological life on the planet, reducing millions of innocents into nothing but viscous sludge. Their combined psychic death screams were said to have eclipsed even the sacred Astronomicon, creating a cacophony of despair that reverberated across the Imperium. At that point, Horus believed that the Loyalists had been eradicated, but he had underestimated the resolve of the loyal Sons of Terra. Thanks to the warnings of Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, nearly 2/3 of the loyalist Astartes survived by seeking shelter in sealed bunkers and other fortified positions. When the virus bomb failed to achieve the complete annihilation of all loyalists, Horus resulted into starting the second act of devastation, an orbital firestorm meant to scour any remaining resistance. Even this, however, failed to crush the loyalists entirely. This was where Angron, the Red Angel, took matters into his own hands, completely defying the War Master's strategy and direct orders. He led a massive force of 50 companies of World Eaters in a drop pod assault, making planetfall and personally ensuring the destruction of his loyal sons and their brethren. The plaza to the west of the Precentor's palace became a site of horrific fratricide as Angron and his bloody warriors tore through the loyalist ranks with unrelenting savagery. These were not merely battles, but massacres. Driven by a primal fury that burned in Angron and his traitorous sons, he slew all who came forth, despite showing some modicum of respect towards the loyal sons who attempted to strike back at him, seeing in them what he failed to see in the rest of his sons. Men willing to break their own chains, regardless of their master. Men who deserved the death he never achieved. Horus, enraged by his brother's insubordination, had little choice but to adapt to the chaos. Reluctantly, he ordered the full commitment of the traitor forces to a grand assault, seeking to turn Angron's impetuous violence into a twisted advantage. What followed was a grueling 2-month campaign, as the Loyalists, vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and outsupplied, mounted a valiant defense. They fought desperately, stalling the traitors' advance with every ounce of strength they held. Yet the traitors had the advantage of resupply and constant reinforcements, while the Loyalist resources dwindled greatly. Eventually, Horus unleashed yet another orbital bombardment, targeting the remaining few Loyalist strongholds. This final act of annihilation broke the back of the Loyalist resistance, and the War Master's forces claimed victory, though at the cost of revealing their true nature and their betrayal to the galaxy at large. The Isstvan III atrocity would be remembered not only as the first battle of the Horus heresy, but also as a moment the Imperium's dream began to fracture irrevocably. The brutal fratricide on Isstvan III was not simply a tragedy, it was a warning to the horrors to come. For in unleashing Angron and the World Eaters upon the battlefield, Horus had shown that even the bonds of brotherhood could be torn asunder in the name of rebellion. While Astartes could understand that a Primarch may fight another Primarch and may rebel, at this point their biological programming, in particular that of the Loyalists, had made other Astartes becoming traitors something that's almost biologically inconceivable to them. In the aftermath of the Isstvan III slaughter, Angron's hatred for the Emperor only grew. He would continue to wage a war alongside Horus, participating in the Shadow Crusade and other campaigns in order to sow chaos across the galaxy. His motivations were driven not only by the promises of chaos, but also his own deeply personal vendetta against the Emperor, who should have left him to die on Nuceria, at least in his own mind. For Angron, the heresy was not just a rebellion, it was a final reckoning, a chance for him to reclaim the honor and dignity he had felt had been denied to him for so long. as once confided to his brother. Let history mark my words well, for I care nothing about who sits proud on the throne of Terra when the last day dawns. Horus is a fine commander, but that's the limit of my admiration for that arrogant, preening bastard. I joined his rebellion because I can tolerate him easier than I can endure the abomination that names himself master of mankind. You want the truth of my life and death? I am Angron, the eater of worlds. I am already dead. I died over 100 years ago in the mountains north of the city that enslaved me. I died after Deshika. This declaration would serve as a grim testament to Lorgar of Angron's bitterness and the irreversible corruption that had taken root deep within him. For the World Eaters, the rebellion was a final blood-soaked path to the redemption their father once so desired, one that would sever the bond to the Emperor and cast not only Angron, but his entire bloodline into the hungry embrace and servitude of the blood god Khorne. Their fate was sealed by Angron's broken defiance, and so they would trade one master for another, perpetually being held as slave of a god, whom they would know no true love from. The next event of galactic import would be the Dropsite Massacre, and it would occur in 006 M31. The Dropsite Massacre on Isstvan V stands as the turning point of complete and utter unparalleled treachery, which shattered the unity of the Emperor's legions and plunged the galaxy further into the depths of civil war than it had ever been. It was on the barren, lifeless world that the betrayal would reach a crescendo. This betrayal, orchestrated by the War Master Horus, was executed with a chilling precision of an artisan, creating a masterpiece. The massacre was set in motion following the events of Isstvan III, where Horus had already revealed his treacherous intentions. Learning of this, the Imperial Fifth Primarch Rogaldorn, acting on the Emperor's orders and intelligence brought to him by the survivors from the Eisenstein, rallied the forces of 7 loyalist Space Marine legions under the supreme command of Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands. The Loyalists aimed to strike a decisive blow against Horus and his growing rebellion. The plan of attack was deceptively straightforward, a 2-wave assault. The first wave would consist of the Iron Hands, the Raven Guard, and the Salamanders, who were tasked with securing the drop site and paving the initial assault in order for the upcoming wave to lend them support. Unbeknownst to the Loyalists, the legions of the second wave were 100% made up of traitors, which were the Alpha Legion, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, and the Word Bearers, who had secretly pledged their loyalty to Horus and his dark crusade along with the ruinous powers. When the first wave made planetfall, they quickly secured the landing zone, albeit with heavy casualties. The traitors then feigned a retreat, something unimaginable for World Eaters. This was a calculated move that would lure the incensed Ferrus Manus into overextending his forces. Despite the warnings of Korax and of Vulcan, Primarchs of the Raven Guard and the Salamanders respectively, Ferrus Manus led his elite Morlock Terminator veterans in a bold but unsupported assault against the seemingly fleeing traitor forces. This impulsive decision brought Manus into the direct path of his brother, Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children. As Ferrus Manus clashed with Fulgrim, the second wave arrived, seemingly to reinforce the embattled Loyalists. However, as the Salamanders and Raven Guard fell back to regroup with the second wave, the true extent of Horus's betrayal was revealed, as the 4 legions of the second wave turned their weapons upon their unsuspecting allies, unleashing a devastating ambush that would shatter the Loyalist forces, who had become caught between the hammer of the second wave and the anvil of the retreating traitor forces. Surrounded, they would become annihilated with merciless efficiency. Amidst the chaos, the World Eaters, led by their unchained Primarch Angron and the Death Guard commanded by their grim Master Mortarion, launched a brutal counterassault. The World Eaters surged forth like a tidal wave of bloodlust, slashing indiscriminately through the Loyalist forces, and often disregarding their own casualties. The Imperator-class Titan Dies Irae, an icon of Horus's might, also loomed up upon the battlefield, raining destruction upon the beleaguered Loyalist forces, sealing the doom of almost 3 entire legions. At the height of the massacre, the War Master himself entered the fray, leading his elite Justarian Terminators. Horus spearheaded a crushing assault upon the last vestiges of resistance. Trapped between the advancing traitor forces and the overwhelming power of the god machines, the loyalists suffered catastrophic losses. Tens of thousands of Astartes were slaughtered. Their shattered bodies were left littering the battlefield. Only a handful of loyalist warriors would manage to escape, their survival little more than a testament to the betrayal they had endured. These survivors carried with them the dire news of the treachery of former legions, further evidence of the War Master's expanding rebellion. For the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard, the massacre was what transfigured them into the shattered legions, who would forever remain at a shadow of their former strength. Too weakened to play a significant role in the remainder of the Horus Heresy, the Shadow Crusade and the purging of Nuceria would occur between 007 and 009 M31. The Shadow Crusade itself was a campaign of devastation orchestrated by the Word Bearers and the World Eaters that plunged the realm of Ultramar into chaos. Following the destruction wrought at Calth, the Word Bearers Primarch Lorgar sought to expand the domain of the Ruin Storm, a warp anomaly conjured through unholy rituals. This was done in order to divide the Imperium and prevent the Loyalist forces from reaching or reinforcing Terra. This campaign was not only a strategic gambit for Horus and his rebellion, but also it was a prelude to the spiritual damnation of one of the Imperium's most tragic figures, Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters. As the Shadow Crusade carved a path of destruction through the eastern fringe, Lorgar became increasingly concerned about Angron's deteriorating mental and physical state, as while the Primarch physiology truly allowed the Butcher's nails to be brought out to their utmost, the cortical implants forced upon Angron during his enslavement on Nuceria were driving him deeper and deeper into madness, and they were doing uncountable amounts of damage to his biology, exacerbating not only his already unstable temperament, but damaging his brain, his nervous system, and even his heart. As they were designed to heighten aggression and suppress reason, they were flooding his body with adrenaline and other stimulants at all times, slowly killing the Red Angel. Neither the servants of the Traitor Legion nor the Dark Mechanicum, not even the Emperor, could find a way to remove the devices or halt the damage. This was the one breakthrough that was actually noted with the second version of the Butcher's Nails, the one implanted within the Legionaries, as said version would not kill the individual implanted with the Butcher's Nails. Lorgar, ever the Manipulator, proposed a return to Nuceria. His stated aim was to uncover knowledge about the implant, but his true purpose lay in a different design, one that would bind Angron fully in servitude of the ruinous powers. Upon reaching Nuceria, Angron discovered that the planet's ruling elite, the same slave masters who had tormented him, had rewritten history. They claimed that he had fled the final stand of his gladiator rebellion, abandoning his comrades to death by combat. This lie ignited a murderous fury within Angron. Enraged, he commanded the World Eaters to extract a vengeance. Every man, woman, and child in the city of Deshika, once his captor's stronghold, was to be slaughtered. However, the purge would not stop there. Angron decreed the annihilation of the entire planet. The final stages of the massacre were interrupted by the arrival of Reboot Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, who had pursued Lorgar, Angron, and the World Eaters across Ultramar following the events of the betrayal of Calth. Guilliman confronted Lorgar in a climactic duel, gravely wounding his treacherous brother, and as he prepared to deliver the killing blow, Angron intervened, his wrath turning the tide of battle. As the two Primarchs clashed in a furious exchange, Guilliman's glancing strikes shattered one of the skulls adorning Angron's breastplate. Said skull was a relic of a fallen comrade from his gladiator past. The destruction of the skull unleashed a torrent of suppressed rage within Angron, as his howl bellowed out across the battlefield. The Butcher's Nails implants ramped up to their maximum, almost guaranteeing the end of Angron. However, Lorgar would seize this moment of emotional upheaval, chanting in a tongue that he had never spoken before, one which had never been even known to mortal kind. As he began a dark ritual, the skies above Nuceria split open, raining blood as the ruin storm engulfed the planet. In a crimson deluge, Angron would begin to transform, as Lorgar's incantations drew upon the power of the warp, locking Angron's muscles and igniting all his synapses in a fiery agony. His body convulsed, reshaping itself through the raw, unadulterated power of chaos. And Angron, the tormented slave, was reborn as Angron, the demon prince, though prince in name only, as he was a slave to the whims of one of the 4 craven gods. The World Eaters' remaining librarians, sensing the unnatural energies of the ritual, mounted a desperate countermeasure as they combined their psychic powers to form a gestalt consciousness known as the Communion. This psychic entity confronted Lorgar within the warp, attempting to wrestle control of Angron's soul in order to finally free their enslaved father. But Lorgar, as formidable in the immaterial realm as he was in the physical, overcame their efforts, and the Communion's failure sealed their librarians' fates. Angron was now fully ascended, transfigured, turned his demonic fury upon the Legion's psychers. Each librarian would meet a unique and horrific end, their deaths marking the eradication of the librarius within the 12th Legion. The last vestiges of the Warhounds had been slain. The name the Legion bore before the Primarch's reunification with them would be extinguished at the hands of the father they attempted to save. All that remained was the World Eaters, fully consumed by the relentless bloodlust and the eightfold path of eternal slaughter they had been bound and enslaved to. The purge of Nuceria was not a mere act of vengeance or conquest. It was the culmination of Angron's tragic life, one defined by torment and fury, into becoming a twisted vessel, an eternal, undying slave for chaos. For the Imperium, it was a mere prelude of the horrors yet to come. It must also be noted that at the onset of the Horus Heresy, the Wordbearers, led by Lorgar, found themselves driven mostly by resentment that had festered since their humiliation during the Great Crusade. The Wordbearers, the Emperor's most faithful servants, had been forced to kneel in disgrace before the Emperor and reboot Guilliman on the world of Khorne. This symbolic act was designed to show their failure in enforcing the imperial truth, which marked a turning point for Lorgar and his legion, where he would betray all, as his complete and unwavering loyalty had been shifted from the Emperor to the ruinous powers. Seeking retribution, Lorgar had ordered most of his trusted advisors, along with First Chaplain Erebus and Dark Apostle Corferon, to initiate an assault upon the realm of Ultramar. This attack was a symbol of retaliation for what they had done. What followed was the devastating victory for the Wordbearers at the Battle of Calth, which crippled the Ultramarines' Legion, reducing their capacity to respond to the growing threat posed by Horus. Meanwhile, Erebus, ever the conniving schemer and backstabber, had carried out a blasphemous ritual on Calth, one that would summon the beginnings of the Ruin Storm. While the Wordbearers celebrated their successes at Calth, Lorgar and his more reliable and loyal elements launched a second offensive in a joint campaign with Angron of the World Eaters. This was the Shadow Crusade, as they laid waste to many of the 500 worlds of the realm of Ultramar. In particular, with Angron and his World Eaters, Lorgar was able to destroy 26 worlds in rapid succession. Yet another incident of great import during the Shadow Crusade was the World Eaters and the Wordbearers facing off against the Ultramarines on the war-torn world of Armuta. Here, the World Eaters, consumed by bloodlust, were lured into a deadly trap by the tactical genius of the Ultramarines. As they stormed the ruined capital city, the Ultramarines collapsed entire buildings and even sewerways, burying many of the World Eaters, including Angron, under tons and tons of rubble. In the aftermath of this battle, Angron's twin chain axes were rendered useless, one of them losing the entirety of its teeth during the brutal fighting. Consumed by rage and disgust, Angron discarded his prized weapon, Gorechild, as it would no longer serve him. Yet, in an act of daring and defiance, Khorne broke the warrior traditions of the World Eaters and retrieved the weapon from the wreckage. Despite Angron's superstition that inherited weapons brought ill luck, Khorne had Gorechild repaired, and he has used the deadly weapon ever since. This moment, born out of desperation and defiance, would mark the birth of a legend, as Gorechild in essence became one with the history of Khorne, the greatest berserker of Khorne, and the mortal champion who best embodies the desires and wishes of the god of blood and skulls. It was through the entirety of the Shadow Crusade that Lorgar would slowly notice that the Butcher's Nails were, as mentioned above, essentially killing Angron, as they were not designed for the particular and unique physiology of a Primarch, or for the long-lasting survival of the user. It seems that Angron's Primarch biology was the only thing that kept him alive. The direct brain damage produced on Angron was becoming more and more pronounced with each passing day, and Lorgar realized that the degradation would soon kill him, long before the heresy came to its conclusion. Determined to save his brother from the horrific fate of death, which, if you asked Angron, was what he truly desired, Lorgar prepared a desperate plan. His whole scheme to lure Angron back to Nuceria in order to turn him into a Daemon Primarch, enslaving Angron through immortality, and forever binding Angron's fate to a nightmare unending. He would drag Angron into the immortal realms of the gods, even if it meant breaking his will in the process. And this would occur on Nuceria. And once upon their arrival, Angron's first act was to visit the Sheka Ridge, the site where his comrades had fallen. Those gladiators who had once fought alongside him had their remains laid bare, exposed to the elements. Bone fragments and weapons could be seen, their remnants abandoned to time and neglect. This exposure drew harsh memories of his past torment, far too horrible for any lone man to bear, let alone a Primarch. This was not simply a visit to the grave of his fallen brothers and sisters. It was also an emotional confrontation with the ghosts of the past, as he would find, in essence, a plaque that called him a coward who abandoned the slave army. But it was not merely this sight that caused Angron to truly snap, as he was here not only to visit the grave of his fallen brothers and sisters. He had come to confront the rulers of the city-state of Desha, the once proud and powerful institution which had claimed ownership over him. The city-state's rulers, still clinging to their misplaced vestiges of power, recounted a version of Angron's past that was little more than a lie. They spoke of how he had abandoned his people just prior to the Battle of Deshika's Ridge, fleeing from the chaos and leaving the rebels to die alone on the mountains. They claimed that his cowardice led Angron to abandon them, labeling him not only as a rebel, but as a coward of a rebellion that failed and floundered without his leadership. The words would sting the Primarch greater than any physical wound had ever hurt him. For Angron, the truth of his past had been twisted, and those who had once claimed him a servant now vilified him as a traitor and a fiend, a coward. Enraged by these falsehoods, Angron unleashed his wrath, as the world eaters and their allies began to massacre, slaughter, eradicate the population of Nuceria. The Ultramarines, led by Raboot Guilliman, managed to track down the traitors to the planet following the defeat at the Battle of Cal. The Ultramarines had been in a state of almost complete and total disarray. A collection of ships cobbled together from various campaigns and the scattered remnants of the once pristine armada made their way to hunt down these traitors. Despite the makeshift nature of their forces, the Ultramarines were no less determined. Guilliman, now at the head of his 41-ship strike fleet, led the charge to seek vengeance for the betrayal of his brothers and to bring the traitors to justice. This was no ordinary punitive expedition. The Ultramarines were not at full strength, but even so, their legion was one of, if not the single largest legion in existence, so they were able to bring to bear quite the amount of force. They formed their ships into a battle line that would engage the word bearers and the world leaders in a brutal exchange of broadsides, each side testing the other's resolve. The Ultramarines employed calculated lance strikes from a distance, and they were careful to avoid any opportunity that allowed the traitors heavy retaliatory fire. Their primary target was the flagship of the word bearers, Fidelitas Lex, and their secondary objective was to capture the world leader's flagship, the Conqueror, in a boarding action. But the battle extended beyond the void. Guilliman had come not only to strike at the heart of the traitor's fleet, but to strike at the very surface of Nuceria itself. The vengeance of the Ultramarines was now personal. They had come to punish Lorgar and his word-bearers for their betrayal. But their fury was particularly directed at Khorne, whose treachery had led them all into this galactic war. To bring vengeance to fruition, the Ultramarines initiated a landing assault, deploying a series of drop pods and launchers along with gunship and other craft in order to pursue and secure a foothold upon Nuceria. However, the Ultramarines had not anticipated the ferocity of the world leader's defense. The Conqueror, under the command of the legendary Lotara Serene, proved a formidable adversary. Despite the world leader's reputation for savagery, it was their tenacity that kept the Ultramarines at bay. Thrain and her crew executed a masterful defense, destroying several enemy vessels that sought to land troops upon the surface. Their efforts held the Ultramarines' advance at bay for a time, but in the end, the sheer weight of the Ultramarines' numbers broke through. The last remnants of the World Eater's resistance were in essence swept aside, and the Ultramarines' troops finally secured a proper landing on Nuceria. Thus, the battle for Nuceria proper could unfold as a brutal personal conflict, one in which Lorgar and the Wordbearers faced the wrath of their brothers. But this was not a victory for the Ultramarines alone. The cost of this confrontation would be felt across the galaxy as the traitor legions would continue to fight on. Now more resolute and resolved than ever, they had no chance of backing out from their allegiance to the dark gods, and so the fate of Nuceria was in essence sealed. As the Ultramarines secured their footholds on Nuceria, the battlefield became a cacophony of relentless and unending struggles for control. In the typical Ultramarine fashion, they would establish defensive positions, clearing space for reinforcements to land. Yet every position that Ultramarines held meant another would be overrun by the World Eaters. Their fury unrestrained, and guided by the boost of the Butcher's nails, their savagery allowed them to overcome tactics with a frenzy of unending violence, their chain axes tearing through Ultramarine strongpoints as if they were mere sand castles. Their insatiable thirst for battle propelled them forward in unrelenting packs of savage hounds of war. The World Eaters were in essence an unstoppable force of chaos, their brutal combat style earning them a terrible reputation. However, the Ultramarines matched their ferocity with a thirst for vengeance for the atrocities committed at Calf, for the destruction of their beloved home, and the desecration of the Imperium. The Wordbearers, though not as bloodthirsty as their allies, added to the carnage, with their fanatical devotion to the dark gods, granting them powers some would find unnatural, all the while using chants and dark hymns to carry out the power of the dark gods through blasphemous icons, advancing alongside their monstrous allies. Their litanies echoed across a war-torn planet, creating a chorus of devastation. Meanwhile, in orbit above Nuceria, Fidelitas Lex, the Wordbearer's flagship, had become little more than a battered husk. The once proud ship, a symbol of the Wordbearer's power, was now shattered in ruins, its armor pitted and its shields broken. The Ultramarines had attacked relentlessly, their ships darting in and out of the Lex's defenses, exchanging fire in brutal close-range skirmishes. Every assault by the Ultramarines chipped away at the flagship's integrity, weakening the defenses, until only a fraction of its once imposing arsenal remained. Yet the Fidelitas Lex refused to die quietly. Despite suffering significant near-catastrophic damage, it continued to fight back, rolling in the light of its own burning hull, firing its remaining macro cannons with desperate intensity. The Ultramarines knew they had to bring it down piece by piece until the ship was finally reduced to nothing but smoldering slag. Guiding the battle from his flagship, courage above all, Rabut Guilliman had resolved that the Fidelitas Lex would be the first to fall, shattered by 1,000 cuts. The Conqueror, the World Eater's flagship, was to be boarded and killed from within. Its entire crew, be they Astartes, Mechanicus, or mortal, were to be slaughtered. Yet as the battle raged on, neither traitor flagship would be able to receive any relief. The Lex and the Conqueror would fight alone, isolated from the rest of the traitors, as the Ultramarines armada relentlessly pressed on their attack. The final moment of the battle in space came in the form of escape pods, as the Fidelitas Lex began to break apart. The Wordbearer soldiers abandoned their ship, streaming towards the planet's surface. In the salvation pods and the Dark Mechanicum crafted emergency escape vessels. Despite their exodus, the Fidelitas Lex continued on to fight, its macro cannons singing in one final barrage of defiance, even as the massive vessel succumbed to the overwhelming firepower of the Ultramarines. The Void battle had become something personal, not a brutal exchange of firepower to end the enemy, but one where the Ultramarines sought to carve out their pound of flesh from the Wordbearers. The Conqueror was seemingly engaged in a desperate battle, fending off boarding attempts by the Ultramarines. The World Eater's flagship was unable to defend itself against the constant, relentless assault of the Ultramarines. It was battered by repeating waves of boarding torpedoes and assault carriers launched from the Ultramarines' battle barge, Armisman. As the World Eaters fought to repel the invaders, the smaller Ultramarines vessels slipped past their defenses, delivering drop pods, gunships, and troop carriers to the surface of Nuceria. The first drop pods slammed into the planet's surface, their doors opening to unleash Ultramarines into the war-torn landscape. These were not the same pristine warriors the World Eaters had seen on Armatura. These Ultramarines, who now stormed the battlefield, were veterans, battle-hardened from the atrocities at Cal. Their power armor bore the marks and scars of horrific conflict, burned and cracked, scarred by the horrors of battle. These were warriors driven not only by duty, by a cold, unending thirst for vengeance. Their hearts burned with a rage for their fallen brothers, and the destruction that was wrought upon their legion, by those whom they should have been able to trust. As the battle on the surface intensified, the Fidelitas Lex remains began its final descent. Its massive form burned as it cut through the clouds of Nuceria's atmospheres. The ship's engines, or what remained of them, strained against the immense weight, pulling down the stern as the ship plummeted towards the planet's oceans. The impact would send shockwaves across the surrounding waters, but still the ship would continue to fight, its hull burning brightly as it crashed far from the shore, leaving nothing but a smoldering set of ruins in its wake. However, the war on Nuceria was far from over. As the Ultramarines pressed on their assault, Guilliman himself finally came face to face with Lorgar, the true architect of the heresy, and the one responsible for the corruption of so many legions. The two Primarchs stood before one another, their weapons in hand. Guilliman wielded two powerful weapons, which gave him a lethal advantage, but Lorgar's Crozius gave him significantly more reach. And when the two brothers met in combat, it was not the wild exchange of furious blows that one might expect from a confrontation of demigods. Instead, they clashed once, the power fists of Guilliman against the war maul of Lorgar. The impact sent a surge of energy through the air as the forces of raw, unadulterated power clashed around them. Neither Primarch spared a glance for their gene sons as they fought to the death, the sounds of battle roaring around them. Yet the two brothers remained focused on one another. Lorgar, after the clash, flicked crackling lightning from the head of his Crozius, shaking his head in a solemn form of denial. For him, this war was not about victory, it was about his devotion to the gods, a faith that transcended battle. For Guilliman, it was personal. There would be a reckoning with his brother who had betrayed him and everything they had once stood for. As the fighting continued around them, in essence, the galaxy watched as these two titans, each shaped by their ideals, met in a struggle that would shape the future of the Imperium. The conflict of Nuceria was far from over, but the end was near, and the fate of the galaxy now stood on a razor's edge. The battlefield was now a maelstrom of violence and chaos, but even amidst the carnage, the duel between Raboot Guilliman and Lorgar Aurelian stood as a moment of singular, chilling significance. These two titanic figures, Primarchs, genetic sons of the Emperor, demigods even, clashed with an intensity that defied comprehension. Around them, the warriors of their respective legions fought and died, their struggles dwarfed by the brutal confrontation of their leaders. Guilliman, the avenging lord of the Ultramarines, fought with a righteous fury, striking at Lorgar with his power fist, the blow shattering the Wordbearer's Primarch's sternum into near paste. Lorgar, staggering under the assault, responded with a desperate struggle using telekinetic power. It lacked the precision and mastery of Magnus's own, yet it was sufficient to send Guilliman reeling. With a determination born of overflowing faith, Lorgar followed this with a devastating swing of his Crozius, the weapon's crackling power field crashing into the side of Guilliman's skull. The impact was immense, like a detonation of a cannonball, leaving Guilliman with a fractured cranium and a cascade of blood streaming down his face. Both Primarchs were battered and bleeding, their superhuman forms pushing them to their limits. Under the gray sky, they stared down one another. Their hatred was as palpable as the destruction being wrought around them. It was to the point almost a physical entity upon itself. But their battle was not destined to remain theirs alone. From the chaos of the Ultramarines' lines emerged Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, a horrifying vision of carnage and frothing wrath. His armor hung in ruins, a testament to the hours he had spent in the frenzied melee of the front lines. His twin chain axes dripped with blood, gore, and viscera of countless victims who had been cut down on his path towards his brothers. Around his chest, a grisly bandolier of skulls swayed, trophies he had taken from the mass graves at the Shika's ridge. The blood of the fallen, both the trophies and their bearer, were cast in a crimson sheen. Angron seemed to wear it as a mark of triumph. Angron's rage at that point was ephemeral, his hatred volcanic, almost a force of nature upon itself. He launched himself at Guilliman, the force of his assault so overwhelming it displaced the previous duel between Lorgar and Guilliman. Guilliman was forced on the defensive, his tactical brilliance struggling to conquer Angron's unrelenting primal fury. And at that moment, Guilliman managed a glancing blow upon Angron that shattered one of the skulls adorning his breast, its fragments scattering across the ground. This unintended desecration only incensed Angron further. The World Eaters all heard a howl of anguish, one which was no mere mortal cry. It was raw, otherworldly, and it pierced throughout the entirety of the battle, like a sword thrust upon the heart of their foe. At that moment, Lorgar, crouched almost at death's door, observed the fight. He felt the warp roil with unnatural energy. The shattered skull was a catalyst, a symbol too potent to ignore, as he began the final stage of his plan to save and enslave his brother. Chanting words that had never been uttered by mortal lips, Lorgar unleashed his dark, disgusting plan. His voice, steeped in the ancient forbidden power of the dark gods, tore through the veil between realities. The ruined storm would then manifest itself above Nuceria, and a sanguine deluge would be born of the warp. That, along with the lingering echoes of 100 desecrated worlds, reverberated across the galaxy as the sky opened up and blood rained down upon the battlefield. This was a grotesque baptism. As the storm intensified, Lorgar directed its energies directly into Angron, his incantations igniting a transformation that would redefine the Primarch forever. Angron's body seized, his muscles locked by an unnatural force, coursing through every cell, every atom of his body. As his blood boiled, his veins were now alight with unholy fire, agony unlike anything he had ever endured. This was beyond pain, beyond the torment of the butcher's nails, as it racked his entire form. His sinews stretched, and his flesh tore and reformed. His very essence was twisted under the weight of the warp's dark blessings. Angron's cries of anguish and rage echoed across the battlefield, his voice both monstrous and tragic, signaling the moment of his apotheosis. As Angron ascended into demonhood, his transformation would not go unchallenged. The World Eater's final remaining librarians, 19 psychers who had avoided the fate of the butcher's nails and had attempted to persuade their father to change his path, sensed the warp's intrusion, and in a desperate bid to halt Lorgar's ritual, they combined their psychic strength, their very essence, into a gestalt entity known as the Communion, a fusion of their minds and their very souls into a singular, potent consciousness. The Communion struck directly at Lorgar's soul, pulling his essence into the Imperium, where the two psychic forces engaged in a battle of wills and belief. For a moment it appeared as though the librarians might succeed, but Lorgar's Primarch-born strength in the warp was as formidable as his faith, and unfortunately for the universe and Angron, Lorgar triumphed, shattering their resolve and the collective resilience and resistance of the Communion. The transmogrification was now complete. Angron rose as a demon prince, a being of pure rage and chaos, his presence a harbinger of doom. His first act as a newly ascended creature of the warp was to turn his fury upon the librarians who had sought to save them. These psychers who had long tormented him with their mere existence became his first victims. Angron's vengeance was swift and merciless, a symphony of blood and destruction. Even as Angron unleashed his wrath, Lorgar remained kneeling, his wounded body spent. His broken bones had not been allowed to mend despite his Primarch physiology, but his dark purpose had been fulfilled. Around him the battlefield was an artistry of devastation, the cries of the dying mingling with the endless downpour of blood. Nuceria would be forever changed, a world broken by the machinations of the Wordbearers and the fury of the World Eaters. This moment was a culmination of his betrayal and hatred, not only towards the Emperor but towards all his brothers. Angron had been ascended to the height of a demon prince, an immortal entity forever enslaved by a god who could care less. With his transformation into a demon Primarch complete, Angron unleashed his wrath, consumed by the rage of the blood god. Angron finished purging the last remaining psychers from the 12th Legion. This purge brought no end of satisfaction to Khorne, the blood god, who abhorred the presence and powers of psychers amongst his chosen warriors. With his last act, Lorgar offered the entirety of the World Eaters to Khorne, binding them to his service irrevocably, enslaving a legion. there is no lack of irony for the fact that Angron, a man who fought his entire life for freedom and rebelled every chance he got, was enslaved by his own brother in a bid to save him. The Legion's path was now clear. Endless slaughter, an eternal tide of bloodshed. Nuceria, the tortured homeworld of Angron, bore the brunt of this new reality as the World Eaters tore through the cities and eradicated every last human life on the planet. And then they moved on to any shred of life. The planet became a desolate graveyard, embodying Angron and his enslavement to the Eightfold Path. This left the world in ruin. The echoes of the world's annihilation would eventually fade into the past as the story of Angron's greater path of destruction would be carved throughout the galaxy. Rabut Guilliman, who had been grievously wounded and reeling from the horrors he had witnessed, managed to escape Nuceria. His retreat was as much a tactical necessity as it was a psychological one. He could scarcely comprehend the monstrous transformation of his brother. For the Ultramarines, the losses on Nuceria were compounded by the knowledge that their own Primarch had faced powers beyond mortal reckoning. In contrast, Lorgar Aurelian believed his actions had saved Angron, as he viewed the Ascension and enslavement as an act of brotherly love, a desperate, necessary intervention to free Angron from the torment of the Butcher's nails. In Lorgar's mind, no other option could have alleviated Angron's agony, and no sacrifice was too great to achieve this goal, even enslaving his own brother eternally. And the nails would continue to bite regardless of his new form. Aboard the Conqueror, Angron's new form radiated with unchecked power. His first decree as a Daemon Primarch was both a declaration of allegiance to Khorne and a reflection of his new nature. He ordered Khorne, his most trusted champion, to massacre the ship's slaves and construct a towering skull throne with their blood-soaked remains. Shortly thereafter, the Dark Mechanicum presented Angron with the legendary Black Blade, a rune sword of immense size and power forged to complement his new brutal combat abilities and size. As the Shadow Crusade would unfold, Angron and the World Eaters abandoned even the tenuous structure of the War Master's plans. Instead, they embarked on a galaxy-wide killing spree, heedless of Horus's orders to gather at Ullanor. Their path was one of unchecked devastation, destruction unparalleled, leading worlds like Deluge as grim memorials to their wrath. Horus would grow increasingly frustrated with the Daemon Primarch's defiance, which would lead to Perturabo being dispatched, and the Primarch of the Iron Warriors was to retrieve Angron at all costs. The confrontation between the two would unfold amidst the ruins of Deluge, where the Berserker World Eaters and Khornate demons greeted the Iron Warriors with frenzied violence. Yet Perturabo persisted, drawing Angron into a titanic duel. The battle between the Lord of Iron and the transfigured Primarch was one of the most brutal clashes of the Horus Heresy. Angron's raw power and newly found speed, along with his ability to fly, gave him an early advantage, his blows hammering Perturabo with unrelenting force. Despite this, Perturabo endured, his iron will and tactical brilliance allowing him to exploit Angron's singular focus. With the aid of his Iron Circle, his robotic automata, Honor Guard, and a calculated bombardment, Perturabo ultimately forced Angron into submission. Even in apparent victory, Perturabo could not resist taunting his fallen brother. He reminded Angron of the chains of his past, declaring the former gladiator had merely traded one form of slavery for another, this time to the dark powers of chaos. The words struck a nerve, but before the battle could escalate further, the Ultramarines' fleet entered orbit above Deluge. Angron's laughter rung out, his voice twisted with scorn, as he welcomed the arrival, declaring that they would all perish together. Perturabo, ever the pragmatist, seized this opportunity to manipulate his brother. He invoked the memory of Nuceria, reminding Angron of the lives he failed to save under his slave master's whip. This appealed to Angron's deeply buried humanity, long enough to spur him into action. Conjuring a warp storm, Angron enabled the escape of both the World Eaters and the Iron Warriors. As Angron's rampage would continue, his allegiance to Khorne driving him to acts of unparalleled rage, he would reemerge during the climactic moments of the Solar War, when a massive warp rift opened above Luna, allowing the traitor forces to assault the throne world directly. Angron was seen aboard the battlements of the Conqueror, a towering figure of hatred and violence, poised to bring Khorne's wrath to the very heart of the Imperium. It was around this time that many world leaders began to not only resent, but outright hate their Primarch, loathe him, despite their biological need to adore their father. This trajectory, from Primarch to Demon Prince, from reluctant leader to avatar and slave to the god of unending slaughter, in essence encapsulates the greater tragedy of Angron. His legacy would forever be written in blood, at the service of another. But now, rather than being seen as a liberator, he would become a curse upon the galaxy that he had once sought to escape, ever living, never gaining the death he so desired.